Anse, Candace Savage Nitsikatsun, Misaskwatumini Kochinia. Hello, my name is Candace Savage, and I am beaming to you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, near the banks of the beautiful South Saskatchewan River in Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We are meeting this evening in a spirit of Kwayesk Astasawan, a wonderful word that I just recently learned and which I'm told means something like setting things right. Kwayesk Astasawan will be an underlying theme of our conversation tonight. This event, The Land Feeds Us, Indigenous Food Sovereignty and Prairie Cities, is hosted by Wild About Saskatoon with production assistance for which we are very grateful from the Saskatchewan Festival of Words. We would also like to thank our sponsoring organizations Eco-Friendly Sask, the Native Plant Society of Saskatchewan, Meewasin, the Saskatoon Nature Society, Sask Outdoors, Sask Arts, Sask Lotteries, and the City of Saskatoon. And with the city top of mind, it is a special pleasure to introduce Charlie Clark, the Mayor of Saskatoon, who has been kind enough to join us and to bring us greetings. Mr. Mayor?
Hi, Candace, and to all the listeners and to our guests, Tansei as well. Hello, and I appreciate an opportunity to be part of this really important night. Even though for so long now, many months, we haven't been able to gather in the same way, and it would be nice to have an event like this out on the beautiful riverbank, or somewhere, as to gather together. The fact that Wild About Saskatoon is still working to make sure that we do come together and talk about and share inspiration and hope about these very important issues that we're facing right now is really important. And I'm really grateful for Tabitha and Kevin for taking time tonight to be part of this conversation as well. I feel very much like we're in this time of reckoning in society, and Candace, you talked about the reset, the Koyas Astasawan, and that concept feels like it's very real. A reckoning with each other, with reconciliation, with figuring out how do we turn the corner on have a renewed relationship that isn't based on colonization and the thinking and the failures of that way that has affected our relationship for so long. And also a reckoning with the land. And, as we come to terms with climate change and with the ways that we've been harmful towards the land for too many generations. And it's so turbulent right now in so many ways, but that is also a time when learning and growth and change can happen. And I have to say that, today was the day where there was the inauguration of Joe Biden, and a time of great turbulence. And one voice that really came through was this young poet, Amanda Gorman, who presented a spoken word, beautiful, powerful message through spoken word. And while I was listening to her speak, I was reminded of when Kevin Wesaquate came to City Council and delivered an incredible spoken word message to City Council within that space, that political governance space, and it felt very similarly powerful. And so the time that poetry and the research that Tabitha is doing to reconnect and growing food on the land, and the work that Wild About Saskatoon has done to bring us back in touch with the land, all of this coming together, I think it's at the right time, at the right moment for us to learn and grow together. So I know you're not here to listen to me, so I'll wrap it up there. But thank you, Candace, and to the team at the Festival of Words and everybody who's made this night possible. I wish it to be enriching and meaningful, and look forward to hearing the comments and the questions. Hi, have a good evening, everybody.
We'll just wait for Candace to come back on. Be patient with us. We're just getting them sorted out right now. Candace, you're muted. Um, all right. Tabitha, will you be all right if you just go ahead and start? Okay, we might just have to do that.
Okay, I can do that. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I want to start off by acknowledging that today I am visiting you through the wonders of technology, but that I am in Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation and drinking Treaty 3 water. I think it's really important to start off just before I introduce myself to explain why land acknowledgements are so important, because that's often missed around the dialogue of these conversations that we have. I consider land acknowledgements to be important, especially as Mayor Charlie has said, in this era of reckoning and even before. And so I'm the first first Indigenous person in my family to have the opportunity essentially to get to explore my culture out in the open, if that makes sense. Because in my father's generation and in my grandmother's generation, those were still the generations of residential school. Those were still the generations of child apprehension through things such as the 60 scoop. And so my family was often hidden and spent a lot of time running, sometimes from the law, and other times as a means to escape further oppression. And so for me, when I give a land acknowledgement, I'm always aware of how my ancestors couldn't be here and that they couldn't be here, but I can be here today. And my job, I think about my job in teaching and learning and sharing about Indigenous food sovereignty is very much about teaching people how to consider the relationships that we have to food, consider the relationships that we have to land, and to continue the process of unreckoning in order that we may start to tackle some of the injustices and inequities that we know Indigenous peoples are still experiencing today. So for me, a land acknowledgement means the acknowledgement of all of the bloodshed that happened on these lands. And that bloodshed happened in order that colonization could continue. That bloodshed happened so that there could be farms and stores and hotels and businesses. That bloodshed happened in order for my people not to be here. And so I like to take that moment to acknowledge the land. And in my case, I also acknowledge that we drink Treaty 3 water here in Winnipeg. Because in 2021, we should not have any First Nations communities. We should not have any communities in Canada that do not have access to drinking water. Certainly not a community that supplies Winnipeg with drinking water and yet does not have the ability to access their own. That's deeply troubling, and I would be lying if I said that those processes weren't a further perpetuation of colonialism. And so I want to acknowledge that, because it took a lot of people to get me here to this point, and it took a lot of loss and a lot of hardship. And these lands have experienced loss and they've experienced hardship. The good news is there's so much beauty in my culture. And so tanse, Sipakopanisis Natisnakasun. My name is Tabitha. My family comes from Treaty 5 in northern Manitoba. I'm a mixed ancestry, Mushkegowuk. My family is also Icelandic and Irish, and in fact met fishing the waters of Lake Winnipeg. My Indigenous ancestors, because of their involvement with the fisheries, my Icelandic ancestors were able to live in Winnipeg or in Manitoba because it was a very difficult time coming here from Iceland and adjusting to the changing climate, geography, landscape, soils, and you know, I grew up with a lot of respect for and the acknowledgement that as a person, I wouldn't be here today without the generosity and the kind spirit of my Indigenous ancestors. So I think about that water a lot. The Lake Winnipeg I consider to be my homeland. So today I have family in Fisher River and Peguis, which are sort of lower to Lake Winnipeg. And I think about when I go to the water, how lucky I am. I'm so lucky to go to the water because when I get to go, I get to experience my ancestors. I get to visit. I get to be taken back into time and place. I get to be connected with spirit and spirituality and food and water and tobacco and life. And so I'm so blessed to get to do this work. And so I want to introduce myself by saying that Indigenous food sovereignty is my jam. And I say that because I love food puns. And so please feel free to share them if you have the means to do so, because I really appreciate them. But I also want to talk to you a little bit about the foundation for how I came to join this conversation tonight. So I am an Indigenous food sovereignty, what should we say, believer, lover. I'm a teacher, I'm a seed saver. I am a student of the land and of my culture because that never ends. And sometimes I joke that perhaps one of my legacies will be that I am the hunger scholar. So let me talk a little bit about that. We have a very long and troubled history of how we feeded Indigenous peoples in this country, and it continues to today. And if we look at the history of starvation on the prairies, we can see three specific and well-intentioned phases that were a means to assimilate and destroy my peoples. So that begins, of course, with the deliberate eradication of keystone species such as the bison and the beaver. Certainly the bison gets a lot more credit these days. We don't see the population numbers that we used to. I think most societies understand that Indigenous peoples had a specific and special relationship with the bison. The bison is both a keystone species to the land, but also to Indigenous cultures, and specifically to Cree cultures. But the loss of the beaver, or the attempted destruction of the beaver, is also critical in understanding a very long history of erasing the lands of people and erasing the lands of attempts for people to feed themselves. And so the reason that the beaver was targeted is because the beavers are, of course, the source of fresh water. And beavers make fresh water, and in fresh water we find more food. We find plants and animals, we find roots that are used for medicines, and we find ducks and geese and muskrat and otter and mink, all sorts of really important foods to be able to eat. But in erasing our history from this land, wetlands were also erased. And that was one of the first major damages that was done to our land. And I think about my family in Peguis and in Fisher River that experience flooding year after year after year, to which we don't see a solution in sight. Despite the sandbagging, despite extra funds, it's not nearly enough to recover from such losses every single year. And so I think about the loss of these wetlands, and I think about this popular beaver hat that was really the driver for the desire to have a beaver pelt. And I think about this desire to eradicate the bison, or this desire to remove parts of the bison to be used for industry and to be used in factory. And I think, how have we gotten our priorities so lost? That's not what animals are for. We should know better. But of course, colonialism and capitalism have made that very difficult for all of society, not just for Indigenous society. And these concepts, these notions were further explored in residential schools, where further starvation occurred amongst Indigenous people. Now, when we say residential schools, we're being kind. It wasn't a school. If you read the TRC report, these were essentially work camps. One of the punishments that was often doled out at work camps was working in the garden. And so here you have young children, my grandmother included, who are meant to be removed from their families, their languages, their culture, and placed in schools in order to remove the Indian from them. But we also know that they were not fed enough, that they were malnourished, and that they experienced high rates of hunger while they were in residential schools. But further, that complicating factor of having to work in the garden as punishment is even more heartbreaking when you consider the fact that those children were not allowed to eat the food that was grown in the garden. That food was meant to be sold and used for the benefit of the churches that ran the residential schools. And so we have this first wave of this deliberate eradication of our waters, of our animal species. And in fact, we know from those times that our chiefs expressed much concern. They were very concerned over the fact that they were making decisions to essentially relinquish parts of their lands, parts of what we think of as so-called Canada, in order to feed their people. So they did enter treaty negotiations under duress and with the desire to feed their people. That took place in the form of rations. We know that those rations are not food that's designed for our body. So we see the prevalence of white flour and pork. Those were largely rations that were fed. These continued into residential schools. And these are not foods that our bodies are designed for, and can be attributed to much of the diabetes that we experience in our cultures today. So starvation took place in that first phase, with the deliberate removal and an attempt to eradicate a species of not just bison and not just beaver, but an attempt to eradicate Indigenous peoples from the land. And then we see further starvation in residential school. And here I'm not going to refer to starvation just as hunger, but as starvation of culture, starvation of language. Further challenges occurred and further starvation occurred during the 1950s and 1960s, specifically in northern Canada. So in northern Canada, including the family communities that I have referred to, there was great concern over the potential for a Cold War. And because of this, the North was treated as a hub for research. Indigenous communities were seen as living laboratories and people as test subjects. Rather than being given food, Indigenous peoples were given vitamins to see how little it could take to keep them alive. I think about that today. I think about how an elder shared with me recently that when we see obesity in our people today, we can trace that back to starvation. That the desire to want to eat so much food is a means to try to fortify ourselves against all of that loss, against all of that trauma and hardship and hunger. And so that makes me think about, well, what is food then? From an Indigenous culture, food is not merely sustenance. It's not merely the things that we eat in order to keep us alive. Food is life. It's land and it's love. It contains spirit. And in fact, when we take a look at the words in the Cree language, our food is micham. Miche, to eat, and michata, to defecate. What this means is that we were always meant to eat food from the land with the knowledge that through our processes of eating and taking in spirit, we would release that back to the land and be part of a cycle. Because that ultimately is what food is. Food is a connection to our ancestors. Food is a connection and the origins of our languages, our songs, our stories. It's a source of well-being. It's a communicator and a connector. And because it is so much more than the sustenance that we eat, it shouldn't be any wonder that we see the high rates of food-related diseases. Nor should it be a surprise that we see high rates of social injustices and social and health inequities that Indigenous people experience in this country, because everything is connected. We can't take one piece away and imagine that everything will continue on. For Indigenous peoples, it wasn't just one piece, but rather 100 years, 150 years, 200 years of piece after piece after piece being taken away. When we turn to food, we should do so out of love, out of comfort, out of a desire for connection. But unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to do that. Our communities experience food insecurity or situations of hunger that range anywhere from 1 in 2 individuals to households to a study done in South Indian Lake, which is a northern reserve in Manitoba, in which 100% of individuals and households reported experiencing food insecurity. These are startling numbers. But what it speaks to is that we've broken relationships. And by we, I say both that as somebody who is Cree and somebody who is also European. I contain that duality. And so I acknowledge that I have a role to play as I embark on the ways of connecting people to their food systems. And part of that role is helping people understand their own roles. What does it mean to be a good ancestor? What does it mean to reckon for the past? What does it mean to undertake reparations? In Canada, we've focused so much on notions of reconciliation in the last 5 years that we've forgotten there's another part, and that is truth. We're not done the truths. The truths have yet to be uncovered. Because if the truths had been uncovered, then we would know what happened to my grandmother's children. She bore 2 babies when she was in residential schools. We will never find those babies. And so, if we were at a point in society where we are willing and ready to undertake reconciliation, then we also have to be willing and ready to undertake hearing a lot of difficult truths. Indeed, for Indigenous peoples, that's the story of our lives. But we're blessed because our cultures have made it through. In all of my work across Canada, I have yet to visit a community where no one knows how to harvest or hunt or gather or pick medicines. It's there. But what our job is in considering reckoning, in considering reparation, in considering reconciliation, our job has to be to take on the work of removing those barriers that get in the way. Those barriers that prevent us from being able to eat the foods of our ancestors. Those barriers that prevent us from being able to step out of poverty. Because they're systemic and structural barriers. And my hope is that our people will experience a personal forgiveness. Because it's not our fault. The situation that we are currently in is not our fault. It was an entire system that was designed to destroy us. And so what that leaves me with is considering, well, how do we demonstrate and enact the values that we hold true to ourselves? In Cree culture, the value of kindness and caring and sharing are upheld through our ceremonies, through our relationships, within our language. So what that means for me is that when I go fishing or when I plant seeds, I do so with my tobacco. My tobacco is the reminder to me that I am connected to my culture, that I recognize the give and the take, that our food systems, that our land is already enacting itself. And so, how do we demonstrate or enact the values? You know, I have to pick on gratitude journals a little bit because it's I think, a personal pet peeve of mine. We have an entire industry that's formed around people purchasing items that will help them to articulate their values and what they're grateful for. But if we are not enacting that, if we are not taking it beyond the page in which we write, we are grateful for this water, we are grateful for this sun, we are grateful for this land, we are grateful for this meal. If we are not taking it to the next level to say, how do I demonstrate gratitude to the land? If we are not taking it to the point where we question our role in society and how we have collectively upheld a series of truths that have been so damaging to the history of this country, we're in trouble. And so I urge everyone to consider, how can you demonstrate gratitude for the land? Beyond writing about it, beyond talking about it, what does that look like for you? Are you on the protest line? Are you writing your MP or your MLA on a regular basis? Are you composting? Are you considering your own consumption habits and patterns? These are so critical because we're facing further sweeping landscape changes with climate change. It's pressing down upon us. And there are thus more threats to Indigenous lives and livelihoods in our presence. And so I want to thank you for allowing me to tell you a little bit about the history of these lands and to talk about some of the ways that I think we can move forward. I go say.
You've been listening to the eloquent voice of Tabitha Robin. I couldn't introduce her due to operator error, so I'm going to introduce her after the fact. Tabitha is a mixed ancestry Swampy Cree researcher, educator, and writer. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba, studying Indigenous food sovereignty in the Faculty of Social Work and the Department of Native Studies. She spends much of her time on the land, working with her people and learning traditional Cree food practices. She has worked on research projects with the National Indigenous Diabetes Association, Four Arrows Regional Health Authority, the Indian and Métis Friendship Center in Winnipeg, and Nietzsche Commons. She told me before her presentation that she would speak forthrightly, and I know I can feel even through the internet, through the ether, how grateful we all are to you for that, for honoring those truths and reminding us of how many connections have to be rebuilt. Our second speaker this evening is Kevin Wesaquate. He is a spoken word poet and visual artist, currently employed as a multidisciplinary Indigenous arts leader at SCIAP here in Saskatoon. He founded the Indigenous Poetry Society with the hopes, which he is bringing into reality, of building a larger community of spoken word artists. He has performed his work at the Canadian Festival of Spoken Word in 2017 and 2018, as well as at the Canadian Individual Slam in Vancouver in 2018 and again in 2020. He recently finished the Indigenous Fine Arts residency at the Banff Centre for the Arts, a program with the theme of Ghost Days, Making Art for Spirit. Here in Saskatoon, his work has led to community initiatives like planting Mistassquatomina, Saskatoonberry shrubs, by the river near downtown with a group called Locals Only. Now a local asset in Saskatoon, he is from Piapot First Nation, where, as he tells us, he first learned the value of community. Kevin.
Tanse, Nietzsche Kosun, Kevin Wesaquate, Pepekwan, from Piapot, Ochinia, but I'm currently living in Saskatoon. I have, yeah, like Candace has said, I've been practicing art for the past 15 or so years, even longer, I believe. So I have so much to talk about. Listening to Tabitha speak really inspired me to quickly find one of the old poems that I've written with the idea of truth before reconciliation. And I call it my food poem. And I didn't even, like, I never had this poem set up for this. I had another poem set up to begin with, but I think this other poem is going to be a little bit more fitting in regards to tonight's reading or tonight's discussion. I have some exciting announcements that I want to share with you all at the end of this. Not necessarily food sovereignty, but kind of food sovereignty related, depending on what feedback I get from my land-based educators and my elders this summer. I'm going to go ahead and begin with this one poem that I had written some 6 years ago. And I had written with this as a team piece that never really went into competition, but it was my own team piece. And we added, our own calls to action. And this is number 96 in the TRC. We've added ourselves. We call upon the federal and provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to hunt, gather, protect, reclaim our natural foods. And this needs to be put onto our TRC's calls to action. And this is my poem to that, my food poem. You see, I've been so hungry that I would have eaten anything. You see, they had 3 dailies of porridge, and they never called it oatmeal because that's what rich families called it. You see, I contemplated eating roadside grass because I seen cows and horses doing it. And I was sitting in the burning hot sun, clouds tauntaun by, whispering of storms behind, roadside sloughs, and what's this dark brown boy to do? Tadpole or two, no net, listening to toad songs as my bear cub belly growls along, and you see my mangy blankets had hit the floor, and I creaked over cold wooden planks through the door, and I pulled on a jerky handle in a green container of a fridge, and inside of it were blue breadcrumbs with a dull light touching my face, and my skinny hand embraced a jar of mayonnaise, and I'm fearful of whips from broom handle sticks, and I'm hoping that this miracle of glass jar held up some sort of freshness, only I'm finding yellow oily liquid over bubbles, white brown drowned beneath, and I popped open the door and popped it back into the floor and over to my parents' room asking if I could have eaten it, because honestly, I probably would have. You see, I was starving, noticing my stepdad had a rifle, beautiful brown in handle, and a flock of geese honked near. And as quick as he can move, up into the steps, out into the home, and backwards, outwards, skywards, so quickly and as quickly as he could reload, blasted again, echoing over these flimsy walls in this basementless house and crying over golden fields of wheat. And a goose splashed in and thrashed for a moment. And you see, I guess they never cured the Indian problem. So please direct me to any proper food channel. I seen my stepdad holding up a band still dead on Goose Leg, and he said to me, and it still echoes through, these shackles, my boy, make sure that they never put them on you. And I never regretted those fields of wheat I had set ablaze, this quarter section of land. Yes, it was me. I uprooted my family from that miserable shack of a home, surrounded by oceans of wheat and barley that waved to us constantly. And I never appreciated any of that, so to hell with your proper food channels. You see, I'll be saving some brown sugar and cream for the children and let them eat oatmeal instead of porridge. And you see, I could do without. So I wrote that poem quite a while ago, and it still rings true, you know, in regards to what Tabitha was speaking on, in regards to reconciliation and, you know, food rations. And, you know, that time wasn't that long ago. You see, like, there was, you know, like, there was really not really any fairness in regards to sharing or harvesting the land and stuff. And, you know, having a proper go at it, if you will, in regards to farming and harvesting. Right from the very beginning, before treaties were signed, a lot of those implementations that allowed Indigenous people, that was supposed to allow Indigenous people to farm the land, were taken away, you know, or stolen right from the very get-go. And I could go on and on about that, but I want to talk a little bit in regards to the Wesaquate project I've started here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And I initially partnered up with a group over at Paved Arts called Locals Only. And it was, I think it was a 2-year or 1-year installation in 2017, 2018. And I actually have a chapbook on hand still, which I'm published in, and it was a Locals Only chapbook. And in it, local artists and, you know, advocates to healthy living for sustainable food have all come together to try to create this sense of, you know, healthy food sources. And my take on this whole thing was, well, in regards to having those healthy food sources, I quite often remember when I was a kid, and it starts when we're children, um, walking through neighborhoods or bike riding through neighborhoods or parks, and never finding available food sources. You know, like we'd always have to, you know, be the rebellious kids that we were and bike down alleys and pick, you know, rhubarb, pick crab apples off of overhanging trees. And some were actually brave enough to actually dive in and, you know, do some garden raiding and grab a carrot or two. and and for me as a kid, I was like, I was thinking about this, you know, and I was like, okay, well, why is it so hard to get food? You know what I mean? Food should be a ready source for everyone. Like, isn't this all land out here? You know, I'm Indigenous. Why is it so hard for us to get all of this healthy food that we should be getting? You know, and uh, it just kind of stuck with me throughout all these years of growing as an artist and community advocate, and how I could better apply that. So, um, and I think it all comes through gratitude, because when I started working as an artist, one of the very first contracts that I had received was working with St. Francis Elementary Cree English Bilingual School. And I just had a fantastic time. I was blown away by the children's ability to speak Neheowan, and even drum and sing, you know, and incorporate these ideas into spoken word poetry. And it just like, it had a lasting impact on me. So I wanted to give back to them somehow, and I wrote a poem for them. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share that poem that I wrote, and I'm going to tell you how it affected the idea to go into Miss Saskatchewan project. This poem is dedicated to the St. Francis Cree Bilingual Elementary School nearing a 150% capacity. Your words are said, your words are said, and your words are powerful. Your words are dancing to the new notes in my head. My words are like trees of autumn days, like leaves that leave me out in so many different ways, while your words are beautiful and trickling out like a spring runoff. Your words are bringing new meaning in life, while my words have been sustaining me all of these long winter nights. Your words are ushering in a summertime heat, and they're vibrant and new, while my words sit still, reflecting the cold days of gray hues. I imagine your future an open land untouched by man, while I harvest my own, and I'm trying my best to understand. And you see, I'm envisioning a day when we could all speak your two languages, like some sort of ancestral prophecies. I envision a day so beautiful, the way of the Nehewak poet, naturally speaking, naturally living, naturally sharing metaphors and similes on hand drums near urban street corners, a place where Nehewak own homes on side streets, and a place where Nehewak own businesses on main streets, and poetry is taught in native schools on native tongues, because your future is bright and nature has been known to change, because we'd be all beyond prejudice and hate. We'd be too busy trying on our latest traditional trends all up and down the block, from ribbon skirts to ribbon shirts. I imagine a place where we could trade in these protein bars for pemmican, where we could pick wild berries in our communities, where diabetes is on the decline thanks to our medicine keepers return and the return of our indigenous diets, a place where children could run out near dark, free of gangs and crime, a place where young men could let out their hair like warriors of the past, only now wearing shirts and ties, where beadwork is valuable and honored over gold and diamonds, and where instead we see our elders begging for change and suffering from homelessness and starvation. We would house them in the best of places and place them above everything. And if a child only spoke their Nehiao tongue, they would be regarded as royalty out here on these prairies. And it's you, my young native poets. I am honored to have been your momentary teacher of spoken word poetry. And I'm glad to listen to you read out loud your wonderful words. It gives me hope, and it gives me so many reasons to be proud. And I'm excited. I'm excited to listen to you read out your wonderful words. And your words are valuable like a baby's first cries. And somehow it helps, I hope it helps me realize that our short time together was very well spent. And I'm glad you could go on practicing your new poetry skills in two languages, as I only know this one. And you see, my belly is nearly full, and yours has yet to taste this beautiful world. So let your spoken words fancy dance near my inner eardrum and swift to my heartbeat. Let your spoken words lead you out into that open land, and never be afraid and never look back, because this is where I make my stand. So I did that poem quite a number of years ago, and I never really knew how powerful it really was in regards to what has transpired since I wrote that poem. I wrote it out loud a couple times at a few events here in Saskatoon. But what had let me to create was the Wesaquate project back in 2018 in regards to when we planted over 100, 200 Saskatoon berry plants down by the river. And then again, we had the opportunity to plant those same plants here in 2020. But I wasn't able to bring out the youth that I had wanted to. And again, here in 2020, we ended up planting something like 500 Saskatoon berry bushes down by the river. And for that, I am so grateful that I have people that support me in the arts community. I just wanted to give a special shout outs to one of my friends, Michael Peterson, director over and CEO. I'm not sure what his title is over at Void Gallery. He has been a huge supporter in regards to these types of movements, as well as the locals only. Um, I think that with their support, they were able to get back to me and let me know, oh, we had some additional funds that were supposed to be there in our first place, but kind of came afterwards, so we could plant again. It was supposed to happen in 2019, but we kind of had a little bit of miscommunication there, so it ended up happening in 2020. And of course, with the lockdown, I had to have a very minimal amount of people that were out there shoveling with us because we didn't want to put anyone in danger. But albeit all those plants were planted there, so in the future, what I'm hoping to happen is those plants stay there for as long as they can and as long as they'll grow out there. And I want my sons and my grandson, who was born just this past year, to be able to grow up as teenagers or grow up as children, being able to go and harvest and pick those berries and bring those berries home, and be able to create whatever it is they want, whether they're tarts or pies or treats for ice cream or frozen treats or jams or jelly, whatever it is. Even all the people within the community and all the youth that had planted those initial Saskatoon berry plants when they were kids, they're going to grow up and one day realize that they belong to this community, that they belong to Saskatoon, especially that river basin, that they contributed to help this city grow in a healthy and natural environment. When kids, instead of going garden raiding, could bike by the river with a pail in hand and just go pick berries. This is Indigenous food sovereignty, and this is a part of our natural diets of this land, and I think that we have to keep pushing with movements like this. And I was recently asked in regards to another movement over by Optimist Park here in Saskatoon that they wanted to plant Saskatoon berries, chokecherry bushes. I'm not sure what the entire list was, but they were so excited to get on to doing this that I signed on to a letter to help them and assist them, and I'm really hoping that it works out for them and they have their own garden within the inner part of Saskatoon towards a I don't know, towards uh, Pleasant Hill, in between the train tracks by Optimist Park is where I'm thinking that it's going to become. So I'm hoping that it just continues to grow and people, instead of planting their berries in the middle of their yards and their gardens, plant them near the ends of the fences, have those food sources available for our future generations. And, as an artist, this fruitation of art is just like, for me, it's just a beautiful thing. It's an art movement and it's an art progress in its own thing. And also, parts of the poem has also allowed me to kind of discover and explore different options, if you will. This past year, um, I had written in a research grant to try to connect back to the land on my homeland on Piapot First Nation. So what is going to end up happening is I'm going to be setting up camp in a northern community in northern Saskatchewan. And then in my home territory on Pipot First Nation, and I'm going to be connecting with land-based educators, and I'm going to be connecting with local elders from both communities to discuss proper protocols on harvesting land, maybe finding different ways to harvest indigenous plants for paint, also to develop different crafting ideas. If I wanted to create um, um, dream catchers, if you will, I would find those natural plants and whatnot to do that. I'm really looking forward to this, and if any of the land-based educators are out there and are really interested in wanting to connect with me, please do so. Contact Wild About Saskatoon for my contact information, and yeah, we'll get this land-based art activity moving into future. Like right now, it's just basically a research type commitment that I'm extremely excited about. A couple of my spoken word friends from Toronto are driving all the way out. I'm hoping in the safest route possible to come and visit my camp. And the way I want to have it set up is a teepee camp. Or if you have the old, army style tent, you're welcome to pitch that up as well. Um, and of course, I'm going to be following any rules that might exist in regards to the protocols of COVID-19. I want everybody to be safe, but at the same time, I want to have this positive projection that it's going to build up into something new and exciting. Maybe in the future it would become a regular camp to visit to do land-based indigenous art activities, if you will. I don't know. To me, is the opportunities on this type of thing are endless, and I'm so happy to connect back to my home community on Piapot First Nation. Yeah, so thank you for having me tonight. Once again, my name is Kevin Wesaquate, Pipiquan, from Piapot First Nation, and thank you all for listening.
Tabitha spoke earlier, Kevin, about being a good ancestor, and it is very clear that that's what you are doing. You are being a brilliant ancestor and an inspiration. I learned so much from your Miss Saskatchewan project, as I know many others have also. So thank you for your words, and thank you for everything that you are doing. Because I was flustered earlier, I forgot to tell you, we have a chat, and we are eager to have you contribute your comments and questions. I believe that we're a large group, so we may not get to them all, but we'll spend a little time now answering questions. Tabitha, you will find this difficult to believe, but Tabitha is quite ill today, and so she will be with us as much as she can. I mean, what a heart, Tabitha. We have a question for both of you. When researchers investigate food security or food sovereignty, they often talk about food deserts as being part of the problem, parts of the city where there aren't grocery stores. But what about brown zones? What about neighborhoods that don't have quality natural spaces? Like, we know that the house that faces onto a park is more highly sought after, and it commands a larger price. It's a place where richer people can live than the house that faces onto the railway tracks. And that presumably it's because those places add pleasure and even years to our lives. So what do we do about thinking about neighborhood access to quality green spaces? Doesn't that relate to your work on food sovereignty?
I'll go ahead and begin. I think that we have to start recognizing our local community food gardens that exist throughout Saskatoon and really, dig in, because I think they need a lot more support than that they're given. for one. I think they do a great job in providing a natural food source for local urban residents. I know that there's one here in Saskatoon that's called the Chep Good Food Box, and they do tremendous work. I'm really proud to know some of the people that are on that organization. One of my good friends, Jordan Morton, actually works for them. I'm not sure what his role is right now, but I believe he is making some move to take on some leadership roles. And I think that in regards to having, you know, the larger corporate section, you know, to be involved, resoilification is a really costly project. And I think that if some, you know, abandoned land is not being used, I think that that resoilification project needs to exist as part of the you know, city infrastructure, if you will, to, you know, not only develop for, you know, like people are like economic reasons and stuff, but we also have to start thinking that soil is almost like money, right? Soil and growing plants and garden, that's money, that's resource, that's feeding people. You know, we have to start thinking in that term. And I'll just leave it at that.
I agree, Kevin. That was so well put. Thank you. Yeah, this idea that we know the things that people need to be well, and yet there are so many obstacles in the way, is really complicated. And so the people that tend to have access to parks and that tend to have access to green spaces are those that, of course, can afford to pay more money for their land based on where they're located. And so it's a really complex it's a really complex undertaking. Like, there's so many things to factor, but like Kevin said, we have to think of the land as something that we also invest in. Currently, the model that we all operate under is that we take from the land. But there is no processes of returning back to the land or investing in the land. And soil and water are becoming endangered resources. You know, and when we look back at Indigenous peoples and communities and cultures historically, all of these things, plants and seeds and, you know, moose meat, they were our currency. So they really were money for us, or ways that we understood money to be. And so there's a lot of, I think, institutional and bureaucratic issues related to city planning and land use. And it's not that I don't think that that is critical. I do. But, you know, I've been doing this work for at least 10 years, and it's hard enough to get people thinking about and talking about how we can get food to everyone. And so I don't know that I have the answer for that, except that I'm excited by the question, because that means that we're thinking about good things in good ways and moving forward in a good way. But again, it comes back to this idea of, like, we can't only take from nature, we do have to give back. And there are lots of properties, and there are lots of brown zones, and there are lots of, you know, abandoned lots. Those are rife with potential. And certainly in the United States, there are many examples of how those spaces have been turned into fruitful gardens.
Please don't be shy. We really would love to hear from you. Here's another question for both of you, and you've already begun to touch on this, I think. We know that in a city, most of the land is private property with very restricted access. And I know you wrote, Tabitha, about you alluded to the relationship between power and food, and private property is certainly an aspect of that. But it follows that, at least for the present, public lands and parks are one of the keys to building Indigenous food sovereignties. It's the public lands and the parks that are the places where, for example, Kevin's Wesaquate project can happen. So are public lands big enough to meet these needs? Are they safe and welcoming for Indigenous people who might want to harvest food there? How do these areas need to be managed, to be enlarged, to be enriched, to be protected, so that traditional harvesting and gathering can resume?
Um, big I'm trying to figure out a way to answer that question and sound like I know what I'm talking about, but sorry. I think in that regard, keeping, the public and private land and opening up those types of sectors for Indigenous people to harvest and grow Indigenous foods. I think in ways to getting that done is either to find some way to have money that is not affected by, a government grant, or money that is not, provincially or federally, given, but, you know privately, privately invested, from, whoever wants to assist with, an Indigenous type endeavor to buy land or obtain land, kind of like a land back type of initiative, if you will, to really assert in regards to, okay, well, I want to be able to grow a patch of raspberries beside my choke cherries with my Saskatoon berries, and I want to protect that. Um, I don't think the idea in regards to protecting that is for me seems futile, because if you build a fence, people are going to jump over that fence. If you're going to, you know, have them grown in a greenhouse that's fortified, where's the pleasure in that? You're just starting to make rules. You're starting to create these guidelines that exist, and I think it has to happen in a very natural way. I think that land has to be open and, available for all. And if there is care, I think that we all need to do our part to take care of that land. I don't know. I'll just leave it at that.
I think I meant protected in the sense of not built on.
Oh, okay, yeah. Don't build on it.
I think, and what Kevin said about land back, that's many scholars and thinkers, Indigenous thinkers, talk about notions of land back and how it can be as simple as, okay, I'm picking a park in Manitoba, but let's say that a portion of the land beside Birds Hill Park in Manitoba was up for sale. That is a way of land coming back to community. And those opportunities in particular, like within the city, are few and far in between. I think that what we have to do in our cities is to, how can I describe this? We need to start having better relationships with the land in the city. And that comes first, I think, with the self. And COVID has given a really special opportunity to be able to do that, to be able to go outside, to be able to pay attention to the cycles and the seasons of nature. And moreover, this experience that we're in now, like what we've seen during COVID, is that our food system is not as impenetrable as we once thought it was. There are a lot of problems within our food system in a pandemic, such as the numbers of COVID that we were seeing in, meat packing plants and in migrant farms. So we have to think about, what does it mean for the long term for us to have food that comes from the land? Because I'm going to assume that we all want food that comes from the land, that we don't want our food to come from factories and to be made of all chemical parts, and we don't want to take the DNA of a bean and then eat that. I think that we all believe in clean water and clean air and clean soil, but we do have to do the work to be able to do that. And I would encourage everyone, along the lines of being a good ancestor, to be a good citizen to the land. And to be a good citizen of the land means to be in relationship to the land. And when we do that, then I think that the opportunities for us to consider what our futures can look like in really considerate ways, like in really thoughtful ways, those will present themselves. But I would say, as the first step, what we have to do is do that work internally. We have to develop our own relationships with the land. And we have to remember that cities are the land with growth on top of it. That doesn't remove us from our responsibility just because we live in a city.
Thank you, Tabitha. We have a big question here. Someone has written, I've studied urban plants in selected local natural areas, learned which plants have known traditional food uses and nutrient values, what we can learn from the Indigenous names for these plants, which plants might have important non-food uses, which plants provide food for wildlife, and the prevalence of species that might be new, plants often without Indigenous names, and which might be affecting relationships between species. I read that not very well, but I think they're talking about invasive plants and introduced weeds. So how do the presenters feel about working to restore combined communities of plants, wildlife, and people with a special emphasis on pollinators and diversity in general? So it is a big question.
That is a big question. But again, like I reiterated before, I'm happy that we're having these conversations. So again, I've talked about this notion of relationships and this notion of connections that we have to create. And I think that there's so much to be learned from looking back in order to move forward. And plants are our teachers. Animals are our teachers. The soil is our teacher. All living things, and some, and non-living things, are our teachers. But as a society, we've collectively upheld notions of capitalism that has presented nature as the other, as the thing to dominate. And that has fundamentally changed our relationship with the natural world. And so, how do I feel about working to restore those communities that used to exist between living things? I feel great about it. I think it's fantastic. Of course, we should want to do that. And we should be thinking about what this means for future generations. We know we can't keep going on the path that we're on. We can't. We're going to hit a wall of what we're able to continue to extract from the land. And so it is time for us to both look at the past, to examine the role of self, and to be active participants in our food systems. And so that could look like what's happening in your backyard. That could look like what's happening at your church, at your community center, at all of the spaces that we don't think of as being opportunities for anything other than petunias. And I like petunias as much as the next person. But there's much learning. There's much relationship to supporting diversity and to supporting pollinator gardens. And those are the spaces that we can all collectively care for and make better, and incorporate much of what Kevin talked about with his Saskatoon plants. Like, those opportunities are there, but it means work, right? We have to be willing to do the work.
I think that, nature is naturally doing it. Like, if you think where Saskatoon is situated, we're basically on a natural corridor that, goes through our province, all the way north, from, out in Alberta, and it comes right through. So that natural corridor exists, and it just, I think as people and humans in the urban environments living on this natural corridor, we have to respect animals as they move through our city. People are always shocked, oh, there's a moose, there's a deer, but we're actually living on their one of the last basins of their natural corridors that exist throughout the province. Sure, they travel, but they travel also by the water, as many of the animals do. I don't know how many times I've seen coyotes and beavers, along the river, as well as any other animals. And when the bison have returned here to Saskatoon, out at the Wesaquate, um, already I am noticing that some of the bald eagles have returned, and they make their flight along this corridor as well. I don't know why that is, that eagles follow the birth and the care of the bison. They always make themselves around that space. So I think as people we have to make room for that to exist and respect that existence, and also in regards to the pollinators, of course, why not? We have to explore those options and see what comes of it, and doing it in our urban environments as much as we can, and if someone has an idea that they want to not only harvest like plants and pollinators, but maybe they want a roost, if you will, like some sort of small garden, if you will, that kind of takes care of that. I think those types of ideas need to be considered, if they don't already exist, but considered and explored. You're on mute, Candace.
Candace, you're muted.
Now I'm not. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. And this is a very important one, I think. Someone has asked, how can I get over my fear of contamination of the soil when I pick medicines from the land? I wonder why so many of my people suffer from cancer. I wonder what is happening. Is it safe to use?
So I can't say for certain. It's going to be so specific to place that it's hard for me to know. I can say that there are opportunities to do soil testing if it's something that you are concerned. I think that the other thing that we have to remember is that nature has a lot of powerful mechanisms that are designed to clean the soil and designed to clean water. And so we have to befriend those plants because they have really important jobs to do. But it's our job, of course, to make sure that we support them, that we plant them, that we nourish their own growth. And so that's one of the things that I would say, in terms of getting over fear of contamination for picking medicines from the land, is know your soil. If you have the opportunity to do a soil test, if you have the opportunity to look at what the land may have looked like in the past, so something like if there's a gas station in the area, I got to tell you, I would not feel good about harvesting those medicines. But I also think that there's an opportunity for us to get to know our local plants that are designed to help detoxify soil and water, and befriend those plants because they have lots to teach us.
I often worry about the same thing, and this summer I'm probably going to be doing a lot of that type of research, in regards to harvesting um, my whatever it is that I'm going to be harvesting for my art projects. I think that we have to explore these as natural to the state of the land being as indigenous as possible, or indigeneity of that land. I think that we should explore that. And it's also, like in researching this, I have so much to learn in regards to how to find those natural resources too. So I'm learning just as much as anyone here.
Okay, here's one last question for you. All people rely on the land for food. Indigenous people in this place for hundreds of generations, and all of us everywhere now, hunting, fishing, gathering, gardening, berry picking, these are activities that are valued by humankind. Yet these common interests sometimes seem to become flashpoints for disagreement, often over rights and access, sometimes violent disagreements. So, do you see ways in which the movement towards Indigenous food sovereignty can can contribute to building empathy and respect amongst peoples?
100%. And so the thing to know about Indigenous food sovereignty is, and this comes from one of my teachers who's Secwepemc, and she talks about how there's no one definition in Canada of Indigenous food sovereignty, right? And really, like, that's because what a Northern Cree community and a Southern Dakota community, what their lands look like, what their history, what their circumstances are different. We have a lot of nations in this country, and so all of our food sovereignty will look different. But what food sovereignty is asking for is not just the ability to self-determine a food system, but it's asking for us to be active participants in that food system, to advocate for a land reform to support this for all. It's asking for people to make a stronger connection and relationships to the land and to each other. And I think that if we remember that food is a great equalizer, that there's a lot of opportunity to come to the kitchen table together, to cook together, to garden together, and to grow together. Um, that's all an option. And I will say that nothing makes me more hopeful than seeing the work of Indigenous food sovereignty be undertaken across this country, because there's really, really, really cool work being done, really impactful, profound, meaningful, supportive, culturally relevant work being done. And I think food is probably one of the most important vehicles that we have for affecting change.
It also reminds me of, like there's so many different, nations across Turtle Island here, like, and it reminds me what had happened this past fall out in the Mi'kmaq Nation in regards to them harvesting their natural food source. And they had an early treaty that was signed in regards to um, obtaining the food for a moderate living. I think that if these communities would just take the time to understand that our indigenous livelihood and way of being is greatly tied to the land, as well as many of our cultural practices like sun dances out here in the prairie is a huge thing. um, Sweat lodge ceremonies, our connections to the land is closely linked through our ceremonies. And not only that, but it's also connected to the way we obtain our food sources. Um, and I think that in regards to bringing that into an urban environment, we could use those types of ideas where when we're taking from the land, that we're respecting that, with whether it's a tobacco offering to that land to say thank you for, allowing us to eat off of that land in a respectful way. I think in taking these sorts of ideas and developing something like a community kitchen, if you will, where different nations of people could come together and, during, the harvest of these plants that we celebrated together, we do it amongst Indigenous nations right across Turtle Island, in the idea of a feast type ceremonies that bring communities together. And in these feast ceremonies, we're always certain to, be sure to respect the ancestors, the ones that came before us. And as we take in this food, we just have to be grateful, and take care of our families, and just be reminded that, we have to take care of this land as much as this land takes care of us, and hope that the cycles continue like that, and I think being grateful for what we're all able to contribute and do to develop healthy communities is all we could pray for and hope for.
I know I speak for everyone who's been part of this evening when I say that we are grateful for this feast of words and ideas and truths that you have shared tonight. Thank you both very much. I'd also like to acknowledge again Mayor Clark for coming and bringing greetings. Amanda and Lucinda at the Festival of Words for all their behind the scenes help. I can tell you that the technical glitches were not their fault, they were mine. And again, I want to thank our two brilliant, insightful, generous speakers, Tabitha Robin and Kevin Wesaquate, for your words and for so much more. And thank you all for joining us. Please visit our website, Wild About Saskatoon, and follow us on social media. We are Wild About YXC. Kitwam Mina. Good night.